In this bonus lesson, I want to go over more options that you have when you're dealing with strokes, because there's a whole lot more that you can do with them than what we've touched on so far. So I'm just going to start by drawing a line, and I'm going to get rid of my fill. We're only concerned with the stroke here. And I'll just make a line straight across. I'm going to make it nice and thick so we can see it clearly. Alright, so there we have our single stroke color on a path. But there's lots more that we can do. Now in the Properties panel, obviously we have our stroke options. If I click on this, we have a whole bunch of things in here that we can mess with. Some of them we already have, others we haven't. To make this a little bit easier to work, I'm going to open up the standalone stroke palette. So I'm going to come up to Window and go down to Stroke right here. And these are going to be the exact same controls, except that this is extremely stripped down. All we have is the weight. What's going on here? Well, this is kind of a part of Illustrator and Adobe software in general that you need to know what's going on. This is just showing me the very basic setting of the stroke panel, which is the weight. But these little double arrows right here next to the word stroke, if I click on it once, it goes away. If I click on it again, we get everything. So you can click through on basically any panel and it will remove some of the less used features every time you click on it until it collapses down completely. I want to see everything, so I'm going to leave it just like that. And we've already talked about caps and corners. If I zoom into the end here, the cap is how the end of your path looks. Right now it's flat. We have round cap, and that's a very nice feature to have if you're doing more rounded graphics. And then we have the projecting cap, and what this is doing is extending out the cap half of the stroke width. So my weight is currently 50 points, so this is going 25 points out from the end of that path. And points is a unit of measure that's kind of variable. In the state that we're working in, it's equivalent to pixels. So 50 points is the same as 50 pixels. It's only when you get into the print world and you're working at higher resolutions, higher dots per inch, that changes. But for our purposes, points is totally equal to pixels. You can think of them as the same unit. I'm going to change that back down to just being a flat cap. And then we have corner options. So we've got miter join, round join, and bevel join. So to be able to see what's going on here, I'm going to add another point, and then I'm just going to make this a corner. So here we go. We've got this arrow or this pointy edge coming off of the stroke. So that is what our first corner is set to. It's called a miter join, and that is just going to give us a nice sharp point. Let me turn down the weight a little bit. That's going to give you a pointy corner at that join. The next option is round join, so again that's going to round off the corners just like round cap rounds off the ends. And then we have a bevel join, so that's just going to slice off the end depending on the angle. So those are your three options, but when we have it set to miter join, this little limit dialog box isn't grayed out anymore, and I can change this number. So what's actually being calculated here is it's taking your stroke weight, so 20 in this case, and multiplying it by the number you have in here, so 10, which would give us 200. And it's saying if this corner extends out from the path 10 times the weight, or 200 pixels further than the width, then it's going to just miter it off. So if I turn this number down to, say, 4, and then I make this corner much pointier, eventually it's going to bevel it off like that. So that's what the miter limit is. If I turn it up, you see that corner comes back. So it's kind of setting a threshold to help you manage these pointy corners, because if it was set all the way up to 10, this could get really, really long before it miters it off right there. So you see how far out that corner goes? You might not want that at all. So you're going to want to turn your limit down until you get your corners looking exactly the way that you want them. Alright, next up is this align stroke, and we only have one option available right now because in Illustrator aligning the stroke is only available for closed paths. With an open path like this where these 2 points aren't connected, it's always going to align the stroke to the center of the path. So the path is going right in the middle of that stroke. But if I were to make a closed path, like a rectangle here, now I have options. So by default, again, it's set to the center, but I can also push it to the inside. Now the path is containing the entire stroke, or the outside, and that way the stroke stays all the way on the outside. Great, next up is our dashed line, and this is a checkbox, you see, so I will just use this line as an example again. I'll get rid of this point. We have a straight line here. and I'll enable the dashed lines just by clicking on the checkbox. So there, right away, I have a dashed line, and I can adjust this, and the dashes will always show up properly. And again, the weight is controlling how wide those dashes are, but then I have some more options. So if I set that down to 10, we have all of these boxes in here, and you see we have dash, gap, dash, gap, dash, gap. So this is going to let us kind of create our own pattern of how these dashes are displaying. So by default it's set to 12, but I could increase this to 50, and now my dashes are much longer. Without putting anything in the gap, it's going to make that symmetrical, so the gaps are just as wide as the dashes. But I could make it a bigger gap. If I go to the gap box, I could type in 100. Make sure that's selected, type in 100, and now the gaps are twice as long as the dashes. Or I could swap that. I could say 100 by 50. Again, making sure that my line is selected. 100 by 50. And there you go. Now those dashes are twice as long as the gap. But I could take this one step further and say that the next dash should only be 15 points wide, and that the next gap should only be 5 points wide. And now I've got a different looking pattern. And you see that it just repeats this over and over again. And you can do this up to 3 times, 3 dashes and then 3 gaps. So I'll just do one more, 25, and let's say 10. So now I've got a unique looking pattern on this stroke, and I can continue to adjust this however I want. And it doesn't have to be a straight line either. If I added some curves to it, it's going to follow that path. And I could even grab this rectangle down here, switch to my eyedropper, and then sample that, and it's going to apply to that box just the same. Now we have 2 other options right here. The first one is preserves exact dash and gap lengths, and the next one is aligns dashes to corners and path ends, adjusting lengths to fit. For some reason they didn't feel like they needed to name those 2 buttons. Those are literally just the descriptions of what they do. But let's make this just a little bit simpler so we can see what those 2 options do. I'm going to get rid of all the dashes and gaps except for the first 2. And I think I might need to just delete them. Yeah, there we go. And let's just turn the first dash down to, say, 20, and then the gap to 15. So there we go. Right now, if you look in the corners, every single corner is lined up perfectly. There's the same number of dashes on each segment of this path, and then the corners are all symmetrical. That's what this second option is doing. It's aligning the dashes to the corners and path ends, adjusting the lengths of the dashes to fit. So it's not 100% precise. If I were to scale this down just a little, you can see that those dashes right here are changing just slightly as I do that. So it's being a little lenient with the way that it's putting those dashes on the path. But if I change it to this option, preserves exact dash and gap lengths, then it's going to 100% make sure that every dash is 20 points and every gap is 15 points, regardless of the size. The downside to that is that you can get some corners that look like this. It's bending around that corner kind of strange. Same thing down here. There isn't a path wrapping around the corner on this side or on this side. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your dashes on which one of those you're going to want to use. For an open path like this line, it might not matter as much. So if I apply that same dash to it and then switch this on and off, you can see how that's affecting it. All right, I'm going to take the dashes off, get rid of this rectangle, and next up is our arrowheads. Now this is a really, really cool feature. I like this one a lot. I'm just going to make this a straight line one more time. And take a look at these 2 drop-down menus. They represent the start and end of a path. If I click this and drop it down, you can see that we have all these different styles of arrowheads. So I'm just going to grab the first one for now, and that puts an arrow right at the end of my line. I can do the same thing for the other end. Click on that, and now I have an arrow pointing in either direction on the end of my line. Again, this is going to follow whatever the path is doing. So I could bend the line, and the arrowheads are going to point in the direction that the end of the line is going in. So these handles are kind of directing where those arrows should be pointing. These scale up and down with the weight of your line. So if I put this down to 1, they're much, much smaller. If I want the arrowheads to be bigger though, without changing the line weight, I can do that just by making sure it's selected and then looking at these scales. So this is the scale for the front and scale for the end. So if I link them together, they'll both change together, and I'll change this to 500%. Now they're much bigger, but the line stayed exactly the same. And there are lots of different options. You don't have to just do arrows. There's also some other just basic shapes like these circles. Maybe you want to have a circle at the end and an arrowhead at the other end. Or you could even go crazy and use these little graphic hand pointers. You scroll down to that. And there you go, completely different look. I'm going to undo back to where we had just the regular arrowheads on the thick line. So there we go, something like that. And then the next option is align. So this is for the arrowheads. Right now you see that my original path is going all the way to the tip of the arrow. That's what it's aligning the arrowhead to, is the end of the path. But if I switch it to this option right here, it's going to align the arrowhead to extend beyond the path. So again, just something that you should be aware of. Depending on what you're making, you might want to change the alignment of that. Alright, I'm going to take those arrowheads off. And then finally we have this profile down here, and it says uniform. This is the variable width profile. So if I open this up, I'll show you what that means. You see all of these different line types. First one is just straight. It looks just like what we have here. But if I go to the second one, this is going to taper off each end. I'll make this nice and thick again so you can see what's going on a little bit more clearly. But it's just creating a very nice shape that's tapering on both ends. And you can look through all of these different width profiles to get very unique looking shapes. I don't use these all that often, but it is worth knowing that they're there. You can also swap the direction of that profile just by clicking on this little button. Alright, I'm going to go back to uniform. And that is the stroke panel in its entirety. So if you were able to retain that information, you now know all of the things that you can do with the stroke palette. But there are some other things that you can do with strokes outside of this palette. For instance, there is a tool right here called the width tool. If you don't see it, make sure that you're just underneath the rotate tool and you can click and hold to see all the different options here. But the width tool is all I'm concerned with. What this allows you to do is to make custom width profiles, just like in this menu, on any given stroke. So if I were to click and drag in the middle of this line, you see that that is giving me these handles on either side of where I clicked and allowing me to change the width of that point in the stroke. So I could come down to the ends and just grab the outside handle here and bring it in, and now it's going to taper off on that end, it's going to taper off on that end, and I can grab the point that I clicked on originally and just shift that along the path wherever I'd like it. So maybe I don't want it quite so thick, and maybe the actual stroke width could be much smaller. So I'll just change it all the way down to say 20. And then I can really widen out the center here. And again, I have a very nice looking path. And again, this will update with however you have your path drawn. So I could change the shape of this and it's going to maintain that custom width profile. So I can grab that again, and you can add as many points as you want. If you wanted this part to be pretty thick, and then it to be kind of thin here, and then thick again, it's very, very flexible, and a really nice feature of Illustrator and something you should definitely know how to use. Alright, I'm going to draw a straight line one more time, and I'll make it nice and thick, 10 pixels. And next I want to take a look at this menu right here. So here we have the uniform variable width profile. That's the same as right here. But right next to it is another menu that looks a whole lot like it, and it says Basic. This is your brush definition. So what the brush definition is kind of the style of the stroke. So right now, again, it's basic. It's just a straight line. But underneath this, we have a charcoal pencil texture. If I click on that, that's updated, and you can see that this has some texture to it now. Now again, I do not use these brushes all that much because if I turn up the stroke weight, you can see that it doesn't look all that realistic. But there's lots that you can do with brushes. They don't have to just be charcoal or simulating some kind of real material. You can also use brushes to make patterns. So this one right here is a kind of like a leather stitching. And it's based on actual images. And just like everything else, it's going to follow the shape of your path. So if you needed to put something that looked like stitches and leather on a design for some reason, this would be a really handy way of being able to do that in a very flexible, smooth manner, just like any other paths in Illustrator. And there are a whole lot of brushes to pick from. By default, this is all that's loaded in. But if you want to explore the brush libraries, just click on this button right down here, and you can see all different kinds of options. So under Artistic, I could go into, say, ink. and try one of these to see how it looks. So this is called a scatter brush, and it's kind of a random pattern. But then we have a brush that's supposed to be more like a paint stroke. There are a whole lot of presets here, and you can even build your own if that's something that you'd like to get into. There are guides out there that you can find to start making your own. I would suggest, though, that you use it sparingly. It's kind of obvious to a designer when you see these types of brush strokes being used in Illustrator. It's very obvious that that was a vector brush that probably came from the Adobe library and doesn't always come across that professional. But every now and then you can use them in a way that just is very subtle and adds some detail to your illustrations in Illustrator. Alright, next up I need to draw another line. And I want to show you some things that you can do in the Appearance panel. So right here we have the Appearance panel, and again I'm going to pop out the full Appearance panel just so this is a little easier to deal with. And we have the same options right here. Stroke, weight, we can do that. We can twirl this down to get to the opacity, and click on the word stroke to get to all of the options, same as what's right here. But what's cool about the Appearance panel is that it allows you to style your objects with multiple strokes and even multiple fills. Now, I do not know why you would ever want multiple fills, because they're just going to go straight on top of each other and you'll never see one over the other. But a stroke, on the other hand, you can change the weight of. So if this is 40 points, and let's say I make it an orangey color, I can then come down to this button right here, add new stroke, and click on that. Now I have two strokes on the same path. So if I go to that second stroke that's underneath the first one, I can change the color to something a little bit lighter, and we don't see it, and that's because it's below the one that we just made orange. Well, if I increase the weight of this, you can see both strokes on that same path now. And you can do this as much as you want. If I wanted a third stroke, I could do that, make it even thicker, change the color to something else, maybe something that doesn't hurt your eyes so much. But there you go. I've got kind of like this pattern on my stroke now, and I can adjust this just like before. It's always going to follow the contour of your path. You can even do this same technique on top of text. So if I grab my text tool and I just go ahead and make this black, standard black, and type out multiples, I'll make it bigger and then maybe change the font to something bolder. So let's see. There we go. We've got nice fat text here. I want to change this to a stroke. Well, I could swap my fill and stroke, so I just have that, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. I could increase or decrease the size of the stroke, change the corners to be round. That's a perfectly fine way of doing it. But if we take a look at the Appearance panel, there is no fill or stroke showing up. And that's because text is handled slightly differently in Illustrator, kind of like the way that groups and compound shapes can have multiple levels of fills and strokes. Text is kind of the same way. By default, when you select it, you're editing the type. But if you double-click into the characters, that's what actually has the styling going on right now. So my stroke is 14, I have no fill. But the issue is that I can't add or remove fills or strokes, and I can't rearrange these fills and strokes. So what I actually need to do is go back into my type, double-clicking on it, and then add a stroke here. So if I click on stroke, I've got a new stroke, and I can change the color to something like red. And now I have two strokes, even though I'm only seeing one in this appearance. Well, again, that's because we have a stroke on the type, but we also have a stroke on the characters. It's kind of confusing. I understand it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I need to go into my characters, and I'm just going to turn off the stroke in there, and instead style this through the Appearance panel right on top of the type. Now this is transparent. There's no fill in it, just the stroke, so I'm going to add a fill. And let's just make it, I don't know, a dark color. Once you've applied that color, as long as it's active, you can edit it using any of the other color tools. So I could come down to my color panel right here and make it something like a green, maybe something that's not quite so hard to look at. And then my red outline, that's definitely got to change. So let's change that up. Something like that. And then I can add another stroke. So I'll just click on the new stroke button, I'll increase the size, and then I'll just change the color to maybe a bright blue. There we go. So we've got something weird going on here. The strokes are being applied on top of the fill. I want the fill to be on top of everything. You don't want to cut into the text at all with those strokes. To fix this, all I have to do is grab my fill and drag it up to above the strokes. And now that is straight on top of those strokes, and the strokes aren't covering anything up. So just like in our layers palette, the order of your fill and stroke matters, just like the order of objects inside of layers matters. So now that that's at the top, I can, change my stroke up a little bit more, maybe make the first one bigger, the outside one even bigger than that. And then let's say I want to round off the corners. This is a little too boxy for me. I'm going to just select each one of these strokes. I don't think I can do these both at once, but I'll try. Rounding both of those off. Looks like it left the outside stroke flat and pointy, so I'm going to select that one and then round that off as well. And there you go. Now I've got something that's very unique. Not very good colors. I'm not going to pretend like I'm enjoying the way that that looks, but hopefully this is opening your eyes to some possibilities that you have with strokes and fills in the appearance palette. That's it for this bonus lesson. I hope that you got something out of this. I just wanted to kind of explore the stroke options and some more advanced things that you can do with the appearance panel and some other options in Illustrator. I'll see you in the next lesson.